And the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be clear that, one of the things that's frustrating is the administration's attack on LGBTQ plus communities started long before the recent attempts to expand religious exemptions. I think on day one, literally day one of this presidency, all mentions of LGBTQ plus rights were deleted from the White House website instantly. Religious liberty, I'm going to put it in quotation, is simply this administration's latest excuse to continue its painful oppression of other people, including our LGBTQ neighbors. This type of consistent state-sanctioned discrimination has a detrimental effect on so many of our neighbors across the country, including in my home state of Michigan. In May 2019, 2 gay men, Mr. Davis and Mr. Blanchard, and 1 transgender woman, Paris Cameron, were murdered in an anti-LGBTQ hate crime in Detroit. And in this case, it wasn't really isolated. According to the Human Rights Campaign, Ms. Cameron was one of the latest 22 transgender people murdered in 2019 alone, most of them who were women of color. Ms. Warbelow, would you agree with the American Medical Association's assessment that we face an epidemic of violence for trans women of color?
Absolutely. The fact that trans women are being murdered on our streets, particularly trans women of color, is terrifying. And it really underscores the way in which the rhetoric in our country has been ramped up to justify violence against people who are unpopular. This is a disturbing trend that has to stop.
Violence in its nature is fueled by systemic issues like racism, homophobia, sexism, transphobia, but there is a role for the federal government to play. The federal government can act to underscore the dignity and worth of transgender people. The federal government can provide legal protections for transgender individuals when they encounter discrimination in their workplaces or in their schools. The federal government can prosecute hate crimes. It can create better reporting systems. It can train law enforcement on safeguarding transgender and gender nonconforming people from violence. Ms. Warbelow, in your opinion, do robust legal protections for transgender people matter as we seek to combat violence against transgender neighbors across the country?
The government, as you mentioned, needs to take a robust, comprehensive approach to ending violence against the LGBTQ community, particularly transgender people. No one single law or enforcement is enough. And even when the laws are on the books, we have to have an administration who is willing to enforce those laws and take seriously the day-to-day experiences of our neighbors and our siblings.
And Reverend Sloan, do you agree? Yes. Mr. Oliveras?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Minton?
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for recognizing our transgender siblings, especially our transgender siblings of color who are being murdered on the streets.
And I ask my colleagues, especially members of Congress, before you make decisions about people, sit down with them and actually talk to them. I don't want to cry because I do this all the time to myself, but when you actually look at a person as a fellow human being, and when sitting there at a press conference as another mother that lost her child just because she was transgender, it's very painful. Like, talk to them as fellow human beings. They're people. And it's really frustrating, especially those that come from a place of faith, that they could just take away somebody's human dignity and say that they're less than, that they're disposable. And just watching this mother say, but she was the most kindest woman ever. And all she wanted to be was free to express herself, free to be whatever she wanted to be. But that's what our country is supposed to be about, right? If I want to be a, unapologetic Muslim Palestinian woman who wants to speak up about other people's oppression, I should be able to do that and not be labeled as some sort of person that's somehow less American because I speak up for other people's rights or just because of my identity, and then trying to use that and fuel that kind of discrimination. So I just don't feel like anybody in our country should live in fear of being who they are. And we must do more to uplift these issues. But I always tell people, especially my neighbors who come all throughout 13 District Strong to town hall saying, Rashida, can we really talk about like transgender people? I don't want my kids to do that. And I look at them and I said, have you ever met a trans woman? Have you ever met a trans person? Like, have you ever talked to somebody in the LGBTQ community? Many of them have not. They haven't encountered. Some of them, I told them, you probably don't even know. Just like many of my colleagues probably have never served with a Muslim woman ever before. I mean, they're probably in shock right now, but they are experiencing it for their first time. But I hope they see the passion or the thing because of my family's own oppression, my family's experience of being othered, of living in fear of who they are. And so I just thank you all for your leadership, but I think we need to be truthful and honest with ourselves of who we are as really, if we're really gonna be this country, that we are about everyone truly being free, completely and utterly, and not using faith or anything like that to infuse fear, which later infuses violence. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tlaib. The gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Holland, is now recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you all so much for being here today. There are more than 400,000 children in foster care